Okay, so hi everybody, and thank you, Barry, for the inspiring lecture as always. And I'll say that what we are doing is not only humanizing technology, but also trying to make it poetic. So PoetAR is an ongoing experimental and self-initiated group project. We are developing real-time and site-specific typographical interpretation of poetic texts and spoken word practices in augmented reality environment. And we will first see a short demonstration video, and then we will elaborate on its cultural and technological aspects.
Skinny language. Skinny language.
Skinny language.
Skinny language. Skinny language. Skinny language. This is how space begins with words, signs traced on the blank page. Words to describe. This is how space begins to describe space, to name, to trace it, to name, to trace those Portolano. The names of images, the land is only a continuous ribbon of text. Until in the end, the land was from the sea by a makers who saturated the coast like those Portolano. The names of harbors, names of capes.
The text was by George Perez from his book, Species of Spaces, and it was documented in a shelter in Munich. So we will start our journey today with this simple but intriguing question. Since we are all familiar with the conventions of poetry typesetting, no matter how radical, daring, or unconventional the poetic text is, it will always be designed with the font Times New Roman, 12 punct, aligned to the left, black ink on white paper. In order to respond to the flourishing of spoken word, slam poetry, and other performative practices within contemporary young poetry, we are looking for new visual tools that respond to the uniqueness and transiency of every poetry reading. The project brings together a group of professionals, a software developer, and 2 font designers that are not with us today. One is an expert in calligraphy, and the other is a developer of variable and dynamic fonts. Personally, I initiated this project 2 years ago from the perspective of a typographer with deep interest in performance art and in young and rebellious poetry. In a former collaboration with the architects Ayelet Carmon and Tom Shaked, whom you've heard earlier before, and I think is with us today, we explored how typography can be affected by vocal parameters in grasshopper design environment. So what you see in these slides are a few recordings of the different vocal expressions of the word so. Each reading of the word has its own visual representation that through visual manipulations like extrude or revolve leaves a clear trace of the uniqueness of every reading act. So it could be like so. While working on this project, I started to explore the field of visual poetry, which can be described as poetry that is meant to be seen. Poetry that presupposes a viewer as well as a reader. And the origin of the idea of visualizing poetry can be found more than 100 years ago in the works of poets like Guillaume Apollinaire. And on the right, we see a poem, Il pleut, it's raining in English, where we can see that the typographic layout resembles a waterfall, and the letters are the raindrops. However simplistic or even literal this design layout can seem, trying to read it, which is almost impossible, renders clear how revolutionary this experiment is. Not only it takes into account a reader and a viewer, but reading itself becomes an act of deciphering. turning the act of reading poetry into a performative act and reversing the relations between signified and signifier. I'm sure that you're all familiar with the radical work of the Dada movement and their experimental typography layouts, be it in their posters, publications, invitations to soirée, and of course in their poetical expressions. And what I want to stress here is that visualizing poetry has always been associated with social protest, an intentional attack on existing conventions of hierarchy and order. The unique visual language was not only an aesthetic experiment, but it served as a form of criticism on social, political, and cultural contexts.
Caravane, Olifando, Bambla, oh,
The idea of visual poetry soon branched out to new variations and new poetic forms. Only the Dada movement invented 3 or 4 different variations to this concept. So one of them was sound poetry, and here we can see a seminal moment in the Dada movement when Hugo Ball, a German author and poet, went on stage at Cabaret Voltaire and read aloud the poem Caravan, a poem with words that have no literal meaning and is meant only to be read and create a strong vocal impact both on the audience and the poet itself. In its taxonomy of sound poetry, Dick Higgins, co-founder of Fluxus Movement, calls for further vocal, visual, and spatial explorations of this unique form of expression. And in our early experimentations in the visualization of poetic text on the background of different environments, we quickly identified the potential that Higgins points at, long before the existence of AR platforms. What he says about the third intermedium that could exist in environments and situations which we do not normally regard as poetic. So taking the lead from former projects that fuse sound and text and responding to Higgins' call for further investigations of sound poetry, we started sketching spaces filled in with poetic sculptures and investigate the possible interplay between a reader and responsive text. And by adding current developments in typography, variable and dynamic forms, and placing them inside augmented reality. So by doing all this, we are enabling a poetic performative space that opens new forms of expression and creates feedback loops of reading and writing in real time and space. However, bringing typography into AR is not an easy or straightforward move, and Matan will discuss now for a few moments the unique challenges that developers meet in the process of introducing typographic layouts in AR applications.
Thank you, Merav. Just to make a small correction, I'm not from Shenkar. I'm a creative engineer at Snap, developing augmented reality experiences. And I'm going to talk about our first experiment. This one, we visualized a poem by Tahel Frosh, Hold My Bank. And we chose to play with it actually next to an actual bank. So what you can see on the screen is the line on the bottom tells the reader when the next line is going to float into space, and then the reader eventually is surrounded by all the lines of the poem that he is reading. So we realized the strength of this augmentation of text that was usually either written or read into physical space. So this spontaneous and ephemeral way of displaying text gives it like a performative qualities. So combining moments from present life and pre-made phrases. A little bit about the technical side. So we were able to prototype it pretty fast using ARKit and Unity. So ARKit and ARCore basically popped up around that time and basically allowed everybody with a high-end phone in their pocket the ability to track any augmented reality scene in 3D space. And this was basically, before that, it was reserved to high-end devices that were very exotic, like Microsoft HoloLens. So eventually, we decided to dive down into the typographical challenges that we faced in this project. So, for example, text placement. When we place 2D text in 3D world, it goes from screen text that we are used to seeing on our screen to this 3D object in space. But then when you move around, what should the text do? So we know responsive typography from these days from when you design a website and you want it to work both on desktop and on mobile. But what happens when you can actually walk around the text? So here, for example, we had to choose what to do when a user moves around. So one way would be to rotate the text and have it face to the user all times. Another one was to just put it the way that you initially put it on the screen. But when we decided to use a hybrid approach where the text only can move in one axis, so it cannot face you when you're rotating around it, but if you move up and down, it can face you. The result, so in VR, in AR, you cannot zoom out, but you can make everything smaller. So we decided to display the end result as a sculpture. So we basically scale everything down, and you can walk around this sculpture of words as you would a normal sculpture in a gallery. Another two things, text attraction. So the text itself is not static, so it gravitates toward the center of this word cloud. And this is to make it more condensed, and also when you put one sentence on top of the other, they would reject themselves to not be too cluttery. And finally, viewer rejection. So when you go through the cloud of words, they would allow you, they would move aside and let you go through them. So as you can see, there are a lot of design considerations that we had to take into account to make this a more interesting visualization. And of course, there is much more to explore. So we will end this presentation with an attribute to the Dada tradition, the sound to the sound poetry, and by visiting 103 years old later, the poem Caravan by Hugo Ball. Okay, thank you.